Well, with the bad weather we're having, I think that we can have one little error. I'm supposed to pick up the mic, and I didn't pick it up, and I tried to tear this one up, and I probably did. So, welcome. It's out of our past series, and a special thanks to the First Bank of Alabama for sponsoring the series. Before we get started, we have a special guest, Rebecca Mender, who is the executive director of the Alabama Heritage Magazine, and she's going to have some special handouts. But Rebecca, if you will stand and shout and tell them what you're going to do.
I just wanted to come to support Ed because he's one of my favorite people in the universe, one of the smartest people that I know, and I think you'll really enjoy his presentation. Hey, Shirley. And so Ed was so kind to write this wonderful article on Lafayette's trip to Alabama for our magazine a few years ago. So we made copies to make sure everybody has one. If I didn't give you one, there's plenty at the registration table that you can pick up on your way out. I also brought a few extra copies of the magazine that you can take with you. Not a lot, so don't fight over them. But if you have any questions about the magazine, you're more than welcome to come see me, and we'll stay a few minutes afterward. But again, we're here to support Ed and listen to what he has to say as we get ready to celebrate the anniversary of Lafayette's return. So thank you so kindly. I appreciate it, Ted, for letting me speak.
You know, it's a real thrill to have Ed Bridges with us today. Ed is back many times coming here, and you probably know him. But we're just thrilled because of the kind of things that he's done and things that he's going to do. But he grew up in Bainbridge, Georgia. He graduated from Furman College in Greenville, South Carolina. He received his master's and his doctorate both at University of Chicago. At the time he was at the University of Chicago, it was considered one of the top 3 or 4 universities in the United States, if not the whole world. So you know he didn't get in easily and he didn't get out easily. So he had to work hard and all of that, and you'll see why. He taught high school history, and then he taught at Georgia Tech, and then he went with the Georgia Department of Archives and History in 1976, and he stayed there for 6 years. But the most important thing is that when he came to Alabama, he stayed there for 35 years. He came there with the Department of Archives and History in 1982, and he served for 35 years. That's longer than anyone else had ever served. And he's still serving, even though he's not being paid, but he's well known. And you can see what Rebecca said, that people would go to a lot of trouble to be where he is. After retiring from Archives and History, he served as the interim director of the Montgomery Museum of Fine Arts. And at that point, he wrote a history of Alabama just in time for the bicentennial. And that is on the market now. And it's Alabama, the Making of a Great American State. If you don't have a copy of it, get on the horn and invite the people in the bookstores to reserve you a copy, because they'll fly off the shelves. He won't make him rich, but it'll make him feel good to know that the books sell out. But he is really one of the most outstanding scholars that we know and that we've had here at the Brown Bag series. And when you're looking at these social and political and economic problems that we have now, you'll be glad to know that we were famous 100 years or so ago. And Ed is going to tell you all about General Lafayette and the impact that he's had on Alabama history. Give Ed a good Chicago welcome. Ed Bridges.
Thank you, Ted. Thank you very much, Ted, Shirley, Don, and appreciate your being here, Rebecca. Before we start, how many of you remember Leah Atkins? She did a number of presentations here, and Leah helped when she was at Auburn at the Center for Arts and Humanities, she really started the program of trying to get libraries across the state to do series like this, bring people in, make libraries the centers of presentations and a social gathering as well, and a cultural gathering, make them a cultural gathering, a cultural center for the community. Anyway, Leah was just one of the greatest people who's ever lived. Leah died last week, and again, Shirley and Ted and I were talking about this, and we thought it would be appropriate just to for all of us to take a moment and remember what a wonderful, fabulous, great person lived among us. Anyway, and she was a we are beneficiaries today in so many ways of all the things that Leah did. Okay, it just seemed right. I hope you'll excuse me, for it just seemed right to remember her at this occasion. So some of you also who have long memories may remember that I did a presentation about Lafayette about 10 or 15 years ago here. And so Shirley and I were talking about this and said, why do this again? Well, there are two reasons that I thought. One is that this is, as Rebecca said, this is the bicentennial of this great visit that Lafayette made. You may have seen the news stories about this. In New York, in August, they had big celebrations for the reenactment of Lafayette's visit, starting in New York, landing in New York in August. He landed there in August of 1820. And the celebration was in August 1824, and the celebration was this past August of his arrival. And they're having celebrations all up along the way at different places where he stopped and stayed and spoke. And I'll come back to that tour in just a little bit. But he was in Alabama in April of 25. So there will be events here in Alabama to celebrate his bicentennial. So one of the reasons for this program is it's kind of a heads up on things that are going to be coming along. The second thing is that I love this subject, and as I continue to read about it, I continue to, it's bigger than what I started off with. I started off with these kind of interesting little stories about different places Lafayette stopped at in Alabama, and people he met and things that happened. But as I've worked on this and keep reading, I've read 2 new books in the last year about Lafayette. The story gets bigger, and it's better, and it's more wonderful. You know, we live in an age where we don't cut each other much slack. You know, public life is hard, and it was hard in Lafayette's time. But my goodness, these people were great. They were great. They were honorable. They were decent. They were idealistic. They put their country first. And there's a degree of nobility about their lives, about their work, about what they did. These were the founders of our country. And, you know, historians, we tend to look at the warts, you know, but as I go back and see this, the warts just don't seem to matter. The greatness of these people, and how much we can learn from them today, that really matters. And I thought I'd like to try to come back and do this again and to convey a little bit better of just how important Lafayette was to our country, to the fact that we're here in the first place, and to the kind of relationship that existed between him and Washington and Jefferson and Benjamin Franklin and the other leaders of our country. And so that's why I'm trying to come back and do this again. So let me start with what this painting that all of you probably have seen in your school textbooks growing up, from elementary school all the way through college textbooks. You know, in the War of 1812, we don't think about this very much, but the British captured Washington and they burned the Capitol. They burned our Capitol in 1814. So after the war was over, in the late 18 teens, the Capitol of the United States was being rebuilt. And Thomas Jefferson said, why don't you commission these great murals to go in the rotunda? So Congress, at Jefferson's suggestion, asked John Trumbull to do 4 big monumental paintings that still hang today in the rotunda of the U.S. Capitol. One was the signing of the Declaration of Independence. The other one is Washington's resigning his command and turning authority back over to the civilian government of the United States. And the third one was the surrender of General Burgoyne at Saratoga. And the fourth one that we've all seen in our textbooks is the surrender of Lord Cornwallis at Yorktown. Now, we've all seen this, and I've looked at this for 50 years, and until I started this work on Lafayette, I think, what is this about? Where is Washington? Is this man Washington, or is this Washington? Is this Cornwallis? And Trumbull was a very, very careful artist. He went and got portraits of all of these people that he used so that they would be of the highest degree of accuracy. And this was designed when our Capitol was being restored as one of the great 4 iconic stories that helps to tell of America's creation. And so let's take it apart and look at it a little bit more closely. So also about it, this was an age of protocol, so everything had to be in the right place, the right level of respect and dignity and placement had to be for each person. So this was a carefully constructed picture, but this is how it happened. The British troops ended up marching up through this division between the Americans on this side and the French on this side to surrender their arms. And this is how it happened, just preparatory to that. Well, a couple of things about it. One is that Cornwallis was a proud and arrogant man. And he said, I don't feel very well today. I don't think I'm going to do this. So he sends a subordinate, Major General Charles O'Hara, to do the surrendering. He did not want to be humiliated by having to surrender his sword to the Americans, so he sends a subordinate. Washington, who's not going to accept the sword from a subordinate, sends one of his generals, Benjamin Lincoln, to accept the sword from O'Hara. So this is Washington back over here. Let's see, I think this picture has a more close-up. So this is Washington back over here. This is Benjamin Lincoln, who had been captured by Cornwallis at Charleston when the British captured Charleston and had been mistreated by Cornwallis. And so now he has the honor of receiving the sword from Cornwallis's adjutant. General Washington is back here. Now, another thing to note is that there are 2 armies, the American army and the French army. And having this hang in our Capitol in many ways is an acknowledgement of the fact to the whole world that American independence might not have happened if it had not been for the French armies. When Cornwallis retreated to Yorktown, the British could have supplied him or evacuated him by sea, but a French fleet led by Count d'Estaing blockaded them in, and then a French army led by Rochambeau came with Washington to join Lafayette in the siege at Yorktown. And so it was the two armies together, a French and an American army, that forced the surrender of Cornwallis at Yorktown. In the final battle, the attacks were led by an American brigade whose commanders was Lafayette. Lafayette commanded the Virginia Light Infantry. And they were the ones that had pinned Cornwallis in Yorktown in the first place. So here in this protocol-sensitive era, here's Washington, and I think there's another even closer up. Yeah, so this is the governor of Virginia, Governor Nelson, and this is Lafayette. And you can see the plume, I think, is representative of the fact that he was a warrior. He had fought there. And the other commander that was under Lafayette and joined him in the attack was Alexander Hamilton here, who I think he's on the $10 bill, right? You remember him from there. So these are with the red plumes of the two leaders. And again, if you go look at the big picture again, Rochambeau, I think, has the plume of the French commander. So anyway, the point of all of this is that America might not have become a nation. While Washington's troops were ragtag, they couldn't get enough supplies, people were deserting, the states were worn out in supplying them. The Congress could not raise money. They just had to beg for money from the states because they didn't have the legal standing to tax. And it was the French money, because of Lafayette, the French troops, and the French Navy that helped make it possible for America to win the revolution. And all of this, virtually all of it, was attributed to Lafayette. So let me go back now with that as the reason Lafayette was so important. Let me do a little bit of backstory about Lafayette. This is his birthplace in France, in Chavignac. It's down in it's maybe like 150 miles south of Paris in the lower center of France. And Lafayette represented this whole change through both of his grandparents on both sides, chains of French nobility that reached back into immemorial time. One of his ancestors had fought beside King Louis on the Crusades. Another had fought beside Joan of Arc. His father, Lafayette's father, had been killed when Lafayette was 2 years old fighting the British in what we call the French and Indian War. So Lafayette grew up with this military heritage going back 7 or 8 centuries, not generations, but centuries. And with his father having been killed, he himself wanted to be a great warrior as this part of his family's tradition. And so, but with his father dying when he was 2, his mother dying when he was 12, he inherits all this money from all of these different family lines. And by the time he's 12 years old, he is one of the richest people in France. He's a marquis, and he's incredibly rich. And so he goes to Paris. He enters the military school along with the king's grandsons, all of the great royalty of France. He's part of that group. He is truly one of the inside aristocrats of France. But when so he's 19 years old, he's in military school, but he's interested, this is 1774, 1775. This is the time where all the ideas of the Enlightenment are beginning to take root in France, the time of Rousseau and Voltaire, the ideas of the rights of man, of everybody being kind of equal before God. You may be born in different stations, but you're still equal as a human being. And all of these ideas start appealing to this young Lafayette. And then when the Americans started fighting the British, and the Americans are embracing these ideas, and the Americans are fighting the British who had killed Lafayette's father, Lafayette is swept up in the cause of America. He loves it. And he goes to see the American representatives and he says, I want to go help. I want to go fight. The king is trying to keep France neutral so that France won't get into a new war with Great Britain, because they just lost the French and Indian War, 12 years earlier. And the king's trying to keep them neutral, but Lafayette says, I'm going to go fight. And so against the king's orders, Lafayette buys a boat. He buys his own ship. He equips it with supplies and munitions and materials, and he secretly sails away to Charleston, South Carolina, where he lands and gives all these troop munitions and weapons and uniforms to the South Carolinians who are trying to defend Charleston. And then he goes, this is in the summer of 1777, he goes by foot up to Philadelphia, which is our capital, and he's presented to Congress and he meets Washington. Well, Benjamin Franklin, who was in Paris during this time trying to get French support, has written to General Washington and said, I think this young man truly loves America and wants to serve. And furthermore, he is very important. He is very important here. Pay attention to him. Do everything you can to make his experience a good one. Washington, by this time, is harried. You know, it's been a year. The British have captured New York. Washington has had to get away. And a bunch of these other foreign adventurers had come, and they wanted to be the leaders of the American army. Well, Washington wanted his own American leaders, and Washington was sick and tired of all these foreigners coming in trying to take command of American units and asking for exorbitant salaries for doing that. But Lafayette came and said, I just want to help. Tell me anything I can do, and I want to learn. You tell me what I can do. Lafayette was so humble. Washington was immediately attracted to him. This is in August. This is in early August of 1777. And just at that time, the British are launching an attack from New York against Philadelphia. So they make Lafayette a major general to give him a title and put him on Washington's staff, but he doesn't have any troops to command directly. But he is with Washington, going around to inspect the troops and get the defensive position ready to try to protect Philadelphia. And as the British come in to attack Philadelphia, they meet at Brandywine Creek, where Washington has the American troops entrenched. And the British, are outnumbered them. They have trained soldiers, well supplied, everything. So they do a flanking movement that threatens to defeat Washington's army. Lafayette said, can I go help? And he rushes to that flank that had broken and tries to help them restore order and restore a disciplined retreat so that they can protect the army. They just don't retreat in a rout, and to fight off the British so that the rest of the army can withdraw safely and fight again. And Lafayette helps to succeed in that, and he's wounded in the leg, a bullet through the leg that doesn't hit a bone, but at that time, any kind of wound, like a deep wound like that, could have brought gangrene and death. So by this time, Washington and Lafayette had already developed this kind of bond of affection between them. They'd been intensely close for about a month. And Washington tells his doctors that treat this man as though he's my son. treat him as though he's my son. And they do. And Lafayette recovers, comes and fights again in several other battles through the winter. And finally, the next spring, through the winter, that the next winter is the winter of Valley Forge. And by this time, Washington is so impressed by Lafayette that he gives him a command of one of the Virginia brigades. And this is a kind of a famous painting. It's not contemporary, wasn't done at the time, it was done later, but to depict Washington and Lafayette at Valley Forge. Lafayette goes through this hard winter at Valley Forge, and out of his own pockets, with his own money, he buys food and clothing and for his troops, and helps to bridge that winter, that horrible winter at Valley Forge. So he's there through it with the Americans. And then in the spring, when the British start pulling back from Philadelphia, Lafayette leads one of the American units that's trying to harry the British and attack them as they're pulling back from New York, and has several really major encounters in which, again, he distinguishes himself. Incredible leadership, smart, quick. It's not just token stuff. This is the gritty stuff of battle, and he was leading American troops in a very successful way. Well, finally, all of this gets accomplished, and back in France, they are following this story, every report they can get. Lafayette's become this great, great celebrity in France. Everybody wants to know what he's doing, and then he gets wounded, and then he leads an attack, and he does this. And they're all following these stories in France. And by this time, along with the victory at Saratoga, and in the reports of Lafayette's success, the French decide to come out and become allies of America. And they formally agree to start supporting America. Britain declares war on France. So all of this, France's involvement in the war, again, gets triggered by Lafayette. Through the summer, Lafayette and General Washington decide that Lafayette might be of more use if he goes back to France and lobbies for more money and more troops and naval support. So Lafayette goes back to France. Very soon he has a son who is named George Washington Lafayette. And Washington is his godfather. And actually, during the French Revolution, when everything falls apart and the Reign of Terror goes, George Washington Lafayette comes to America and stays with the Washingtons, George and Martha Washington. He lives with them when they're president, when Washington's president, during the French Revolution, to protect the boy. So I mean, this bond, one other thing, Washington did not have any children of his own. And Lafayette had lost his father at the age of 2. So this really was a father-son bonding. Washington was famously formal, and he kept people at a distance. He always observed the proprieties. But with Lafayette, there was a bond that was really powerful, of a father kind of son bond. And this continued until President Washington's death. This deep friendship. The letters between them, reports on when Lafayette's in battle and reporting back, or when General Washington is sending information to Lafayette, the tone of intimacy and closeness between them is just a wonderful and amazing thing to read those letters. So anyway, Lafayette then they get through Valley Forge. This is a portrait of Lafayette that was done at the time. This by Charles Wilson Peale. Now, Lafayette's only 23 years old when this is done, and he's prematurely balding. But even the story, these portraits are interesting. This was done by Peale General Washington, so that Washington would have a portrait of his friend Lafayette, and peeled in another portrait of Washington that Lafayette would have of his friend President Washington. So this was a matched set, one for each other, before the time of photography. So this was what Lafayette looked like when he returned to Paris, and sure enough, he was able to get huge increases in commitment for naval forces, for troops, and for money for the Americans. And then he comes back in late 1780. The war is still in terrible shape. The British have conquered Savannah and Charleston and Wilmington, North Carolina. They've already entrenched themselves in the South. They hold New York. Washington's struggling to keep his army together. And then General Washington, Clinton starts moving up from South Carolina to North Carolina into Virginia. You know, the Battle of Kings Mountain and Camden and all those battles that we read about in the Carolinas. Some of you may have visited those battlefield sites. This was Cornwallis running amok with virtually no strong American defense. He gets into Virginia. He has 7,000 to 8,000 men under his command. Lafayette has 1,200 men, about 1/6 of General Cornwallis's forces. But Lafayette starts using these American tactics of attack, fall back, harry the troops, cut the supply line. When you see a small detachment out, attack them, don't attack the big army. Never have a hard face-to-face with the big army. And he maneuvers Cornwallis all around Virginia, surrendering it, but attacking and backing off, attacking, and wearing Cornwallis out. So it was Lafayette's fighting with Cornwallis in Virginia that wore him out, that caused him to retreat to Yorktown. And then, so he retreats to Yorktown, the French army appears, the ships appear, and Count d'Estaing, the French commander, says, attack now, attack now. We got him pinned up. And Lafayette says, no, this is General Washington's. This should be his honor. And he steps back and he lets Washington take over. And Washington takes command. And then Washington uses Lafayette as one of the key commanders under him. But it's General Washington's. It's an American victory that happens there, led by General Washington. And that's because Lafayette was prudent, stepped back and deferred. And also, it allowed them to build a superior army so that there wouldn't be as much bloodshed. Cornwallis knew that there was no way for him to go. He was boxed in, massively outnumbered by the time Washington and his troops were there. So, and then Lafayette goes back to France after the victory at Yorktown. Originally, and then the treaty is signed, peace comes, and Lafayette is in Paris, and he becomes this great friend of the Americans who were in Paris, of Franklin and Adams. There is a beautiful book. There's so many. But I'll just finish this one called Revolutionary Brothers. It's just about the friendship between Lafayette and Thomas Jefferson. It really begins when they are in France. And Jefferson is the American ambassador to France. And when the French revolutionaries start rising up to try to overthrow the monarchy in France, Lafayette becomes the natural leader, and Thomas Jefferson counsels with him, and they try to create a government in France that is like America, a representative democracy with a token king like in England. But as the French Revolution spirals out of control, it becomes crazy. The radicals go nuts. They started guillotining people. They started executing thousands of aristocrats get guillotined. And Lafayette backs away, said, no, this is not what I'm in for. I want to create a government of law, a model like the American government. I don't want this radical society where we're just killing people. And so Lafayette, originally, who was a leader of the French Revolution, becomes a target of the revolution himself. He has to escape. He's captured by the Prussians and the Austrians, spends more than 5 years in a prison, in really horrible conditions in a prison, and then is released in the late 1790s because the U.S. government is lobbying the Prussians and the Austrians to release this friend of America. But he comes back, and by this time, Napoleon has taken over in France, and Napoleon doesn't like Lafayette because Lafayette wants to have a government like America, not a dictatorship like Napoleon has. So Lafayette suffers all those years that Napoleon is in charge. And then after Napoleon is defeated at Waterloo and the monarchy comes back, the monarchy doesn't like Lafayette because he had contributed to the revolution in 1789 in the first place. So in 1824 then, Lafayette is 66 years old. He has suffered for more than 30 years, been imprisoned, been bothered by Napoleon, by the monarchy, by the radical French Jacobinists, and the president at that time is James Monroe, who interestingly, this stuff is just so great, you couldn't make it up. Monroe had been an officer in Washington's staff who had helped take care of Lafayette when he was wounded at Brandywine. So by this time in 1824, Monroe is president of the United States, and he asked Congress to pass a bill, an act, that invite Lafayette to come back to the United States to see how this new country that he had helped make possible was doing, and to accept the gratitude of an appreciative and grateful nation. So that's the source then of this great visit. Lafayette arrived in New York. This is Lafayette that at the time that he came to the United States at the age of 67, 40 years, more than 40 years after his great success at Yorktown. And we, hawkers and souvenir sellers are not new. They're in museums all across the eastern part of the United States have cabinets of stuff like this that are souvenir things that were taken from Lafayette's visit and all the different celebrations. When he arrived, the newspapers would report, this is what the celebration was like in New York. And they would even print the full speeches that were made. So the next place that that Lafayette would visit would read about the accounts of what took place in New York, and they would try to make a bigger and more spectacular event than what New York did. And so Lafayette lands in New York, have big celebrations there, the first kind of almost a ticker tape type parade. And they go up to Boston. He visits with John Adams, again, who he had worked with 40 years earlier when Adams was an American minister to France. They have a long visit, and he comes down to Philadelphia. This is a souvenir shawl that was made of the great celebrations in Philadelphia when Lafayette visited there. He went down to see the new Capitol, and he saw the painting that Trumbull had done. The painting of him at Yorktown had just gone up in the Capitol 4 years before Lafayette got there. So there were big receptions and events. He spoke to Congress, was welcomed at the White House. He went out to Mount Vernon to visit Lafayette's gravesite. And there he found a key to the Bastille that he had sent during the French Revolution. He had sent Washington one of the keys, a souvenir keys to the Bastille. He went down to Charlottesville and visited with Jefferson, spent 12, 14 days at Jefferson. Jefferson showed him the new University of Virginia that he was building, and they talked about all of the experiences they had. A wonderful and memorable time together, both of them knowing that they would probably never see each other again. Then he came back, another view of the Capitol without the dome. The dome still wasn't completed at that time. And, he got back to Washington just as the presidential election of 1824 was happening. And again, you may remember this election from your history book. I think it's the only election in American history that went to the House of Representatives because the Electoral College did not come up with a majority for any candidate. This is when Henry Clay, John Quincy Adams, and Andrew Jackson and William Crawford were all running against each other, and nobody got a majority. And Henry Clay saw that he had no chance of winning, and he said, I think John Quincy Adams would be a better president. And so he threw his support to John Quincy Adams. Andrew Jackson was outraged and denounced this as a corrupt bargain. But Lafayette was there through the middle of all this stuff, from the election in November all the way through the time it went to the House of Representatives in February. He was actually staying in the same tavern as Andrew Jackson. Got to know Jackson there. So then after this finishes, after the election is finished in February of 1825, Lafayette then begins this great trip. He's going to visit every state in the Union and again, to receive their welcome and to see what they've done. So he leaves from Washington, comes down the Chesapeake Bay, then comes inland across here to Raleigh, down here. At Camden, he stops and lays the cornerstone for a monument to his friend, Count Pulaski, who was killed in the Battle of Camden. Comes down to Columbia, then to Charleston, by water to Charleston, Savannah, up by riverboat to Augusta, and then across from Augusta to Montgomery, following this route that, you've had programs here on the Federal Road, I think, at different times, but this was this first road that was built through Indian Territory, basically from Milledgeville, Georgia, across through Indian Territory to Montgomery. And it went on down, it was connected eventually to Mobile. But this federal road was the opening road in there, and Lafayette comes up to Augusta and gets on a carriage and comes across. And I've got some slides here that just show the route a little bit better. One other thing, and this is just amazing stuff going on. When Lafayette arrives here in March of 1825, it is the month after what's called the Treaty of Indian Springs. So after the War of 1814 against the Indians, the Creek Indian War was over in 1814, and Andrew Jackson signed a treaty with the Creeks. They gave up all this land that became Alabama, and this was the Creek Reserve. This was left to the Indians after the Creek War of 1814. So in February of 1825, as Lafayette was on his way, the same month he left Washington, William McIntosh, the Creek leader, Tustenuggee Hootke, one of the Creek leaders, signed a treaty with the Americans in which he agreed to give up all of the Georgia land that the Creeks owned and to move west to what's now Oklahoma. this treaty was not approved by the Creek National Council. And the Creek National Council had passed a law that said any Indian leader who cedes Indian land to the United States without the approval of the Creek National Council is a traitor. And so, again, Lafayette arrives the month after McIntosh had signed this treaty. One other little thing. Let me go back and talk about this just a second. This Indian land was presided over by an agent from the United States named Benjamin Hawkins. Benjamin Hawkins had been sent in 1796 by President Washington to come down and live among the Creeks and try to teach them American practices of farming and animal husbandry so that the Creeks could learn to live like the Americans and live side by side with the Americans as neighbors. So Hawkins had come down. This was Hawkins. This is another one of those connections. Hawkins was from North Carolina. He was a student at Princeton when the American Revolution started. He had a facility for languages, and he was good in French, and Washington took him to be his interpreter for the French. So this, as a young man, he and Lafayette had known each other in Washington's offices. He had served as a senator from North Carolina, and then in 1796, Washington sent him down to live among the Indians. He spent the last 20 years of his life living among the Creeks, trying again to teach them to live side by side with the Americans. It didn't work out. The Creek War of 1813, 1814 took place, and the Creeks were defeated. Hawkins died in 1816. So again, this treaty then was done by McIntosh after Hawkins's death. This is a painting of this plan of civilization that envisioned what life would be like among the Creeks if they adopted Hawkins' plan. And this is actually a diagram of Hawkins' compound on the Flint River in Georgia. And you probably can't see this on the map, but right down here is where the Federal Road came in. It went right through the middle of all these buildings. And here's the ferry that crossed over, and the Federal Road continued here to Pensacola and New Orleans through Alabama. This is the same route. This is the same route that Lafayette followed. So this is Tustenuggee Hootke, William McIntosh, who signed the illegal treaty. He was sentenced by the Creek National Council to death for having done this illegal treaty. And actually, the treaty was so bad, so flawed, it's the only treaty in American history that's been repudiated by the Senate. The Senate first approved of it, and then when they learned how corrupt it was, they repudiated the treaty, formally repudiated it. But he was under a death sentence as Lafayette passed through his territory. And he was executed by a group led by Minowa. You probably know him. He was at Horseshoe Bend. He was one of the few of the Creek warriors to survive at Horseshoe Bend. And then in 1825, he was in charge of the execution squad for McIntosh. And they killed him in early May, the month after Lafayette had passed through. So this is kind of the drama of all this. It's just amazing story. So again, you may not be able to see this really well, but on this map, this says Old Agency right there. That's the place. The old agency was where Benjamin Hawkins' place was. That was the diagram I had just showed you. So the Federal Road came through here, crossed from what's now Macon, crossed the Flint at the old agency. Lafayette came on across here, stopped one place along the way, and then showed up on March 31st, 1825, here at Fort Mitchell on the Chattahoochee River on the other side. Got a ferry across, came up at Fort Mitchell, and was met there by the delegation of Alabama leaders and also by Creek leaders, so that the Creeks were going to escort him from Fort Mitchell all the way across over to Montgomery. And the Creek delegation who met him was led by Chili McIntosh, the son of William McIntosh. So they continued. This is a map that was done in the 1840s, and I use it because it's much more detailed. It's a famous, wonderful La Tourette map. For those of you who love maps, it's just a great way to study and learn Alabama. But so this is where the federal road comes into Fort Mitchell. They cross here, and I think I've got a close-up of this section so you can see it more closely. Yeah, so Fort Mitchell is here, and they crossed the river. They were welcomed by the Indians and the Alabama dignitaries, and then they went up. This says Elliott's Store because this was done in the 1840s, but it was a store operated by Haynes Crabtree in 1825. And they spent the first night then in Alabama with Haynes Crabtree's store. The next day, they crossed what's now Russell County on the federal road to where Fort Bainbridge was. And there, another American who had married an Indian woman, Kendall Lewis, had a tavern, and they stopped there. That was the second day. And then on the third day, they left from Kendall Lewis's tavern across again over through what's now Macon County, Polecat Springs, to Mount Meigs. Now, those of you who go into Montgomery or back and forth on 85, you know, the Lion Creek that you cross there, the bridge, well, Mount Meigs just past it, but that line was the Indian boundary line. So all of this land on this side was Indian land, and this was the land ceded to the Americans after 1814 at the Treaty of Fort Jackson. So they gathered at Mount Meigs, and the next morning, Sunday morning, April 3rd, 1825, Thomas Woodward, later in his reminiscences, said, "There's never been anything like this, and there'll never be anything like it again." About 3,000 people came out to Mount Meigs, and they accompanied Lafayette as he goes from Mount Meigs into Montgomery. Let me get that slide. I think. Oh yeah, that's Lucas Tavern, which has been restored at Old Alabama Town, is the place where they encamped for that last night, and hit Lucas Tavern, and then they come on into Montgomery. They're welcomed in Montgomery by Governor Israel Pickens. Big celebration. That's Governor Pickens. A ball on Monday night is held at Freeney's Tavern, which is called the Bell Tavern. This is a photograph of the tavern 80 or 90 years later when it was kind of run down. It was the nicest place in Montgomery in 1825, and the ball was held upstairs here in the tavern. This is another picture of it. This is the bell from the tavern that we actually have in the collections of the state archives. And those of you who go to the, been in Montgomery, the Renaissance Hotel, this little pavilion where they have outside music is where Freeney's Tavern was. They have a big celebration there. These are the manifest, all the party things they bought. And they get on steamboats and go downriver. I'm sorry, I'm running out of time. Don't have time for talking about all of these events that took place in Montgomery and on the steamboat and along the way. But they get on the steamboat Henderson. After the party ends at midnight, Lafayette and his group get on the boat and they sleep on the boat. As they go down, they make a stop at Selma. They don't get off the boat. They just have speeches at the dock. And then they go on down to Cahaba, where they have the formal, which is in the state capitol. They have the formal reception by the state, and go on downriver from Cahaba down to Claiborne. This is actually a heating pot from the steamboat Henderson that Lafayette was on. A guy who was diving illegally on sunken riverboats in Alabama rivers took this, and maybe it was a sense of guilt, but he gave it to the archives. And let's see, okay, yep. The State House at Cahaba, where they received him, have a barbecue, big events, Masonic events, and all of that. The archives actually has the key to that State House in our collection. Again, this is the bill for painting for the State House, painting the State House to get it ready for Lafayette. The state spent more money than it actually had in its treasury for the parties and events and fixing things up for Lafayette. And goes on down to Mobile, and Mobile, of course, they know how to party. They had huge celebrations for him, and then he leaves the state, going on down. Another boat had been sent for him at Mobile, and he goes from Mobile around down to New Orleans, where he resumes this trip back around. That's the other building is connected with Washington that's still standing is the old Masonic Lodge there at Purdue Hill. And James Dellett was the Speaker of the House. He spoke there. Anyway, they're just wonderful events. A map of Mobile at the time, and I show you the sites where Washington visited, where Lafayette visited. But then he goes back up, and he goes back, and he ends up getting back in Boston just in time to lay the cornerstone for the Bunker Hill Memorial on June 17th, 1825, stays on in the United States for another couple of months, celebrates his 68th birthday, and then sails back to France in August of 1825, having received the thanks of a grateful nation. I'm thankful for you for indulging me in this. Obviously, I just love this story. I wish I could talk on for hours about it, but thank you for listening. Thank you.
Questions?
Trespassed on your time, but maybe I should just stand up here. If somebody wants to come say something, or
do you want to take questions?
I will take questions, but
okay.
Yes, sir.
I'm just curious how Lafayette is held in France today.
That's a great question. He's not honored in France, because again, the revolutionary, he was not revolutionary enough for many of the revolutionaries. He was not enough of a supporter of the monarchy for them to like him. He didn't support Napoleon, and so he's not venerated anything like what he is here in America. But I do think that what it was General Pershing, who in World War I, when he arrives in France, says, "Lafayette, we are here." That was, Pershing really hit it out of the park on that one. That was just so perfect for him to say that when we really did come in at a key time to help save France. Yes, sir.
Was Lafayette able to keep his money and property?
No, he lost a lot of it. But his wife, who was extraordinary, she is almost as extraordinary as he was. She helped save some of the family properties so that he never lived in poverty and penury. But it was nothing like the wealth that he enjoyed before the Revolution. I think it was one or two estates that was enough to keep him going and support him and his family.
Ed, I was just going to say that Scotty Kirkland, who some of you might know as one of the archivists at the State Archives, he was just doing some research on Lafayette, and he made a comment that the amount of money Alabama spent on his trip would equate to about $4 billion in today's number.
Well-
So, and that they had to spread it out over several years to be able, and I think a lot of people got stiffed for their money because like people who offered up liquor for these big fancy parties didn't always get paid back. So
yeah.
it was quite controversial, but that's a lot of money if you think about it.
Yeah, I mean, again, it depleted the total reserves. So they had to like pay on payments after the bills would come in. Yeah.
How old was he when he died?
He died in, I think it was 1834. So he would have been what, 77? No, yeah, 77.
What happened to his son at Washington?
I don't know. His son, George Washington Lafayette, accompanied him on this tour. So he came back, was with him. He had a secretary, a servant, and his son, George Washington Lafayette.
Any more questions? I want to point out one thing, Dr. Bridges. You work a map like James Spann. This is Polecat Springs, and
Yeah.
you're as good as James Spann. You are.
Aren't maps, old maps are just so wonderful. They're just so wonderful.
There's very few stories that I know even about my own family that I could stand up here and tell you like he just told you this story. So I think it's wonderful, and I think this is a testament to why it's so important that we know our history and we're reminded about our history and that these stories are still being told. So I want to thank you so much, Dr. Bridges, for keeping these stories alive and sharing them with us because we've heard it, but we don't know it. We know it now.
There's stuff there to inspire us all, to make us better people. So,
Well, you
yeah.
inspire us all and you make us better people too. So thank you.
Thank you.
One more hand for Dr. Bridges. Thank you. And I want to thank Rebecca for bringing the articles and the magazines. Make sure you pick those up. Next week, we have Matthew Downs with us. And Matthew has been with us before, and he is a fantastic presenter as well. And he will be talking about the effects of the Great War on the South. So please come back. I also want to point out one thing. Then the next week, we will have Miss Ruth Cook with us. And Miss Ruth Cook is with us today in the back of the room because she's a fan of Brown Bag, but more importantly, she's a fan of Dr. Ed Bridges. So she'll be back with us in a couple of weeks. So make sure you put this on your rotation. Thank you again so much to First Bank of Alabama for the sponsorship. Mr. Chris, Miss Jane. Okay, all right. She's got those back there at the back for you. Grab some extra cookies and thank you to Coosa Valley Medical Center for those. Y'all have a great week.